Good morning and welcome to today's program on how do you embrace meaningful change to ensure your organization remains competitive. My name is Ethan Chazin. I am a New York-based organizational transformation coach, and I'm excited to be having you join us today for this webinar. So let's start out with a primer. And everyone knows that not all change is good or even necessary, but in a world that is constantly changing, it is to our advantage to learn how to adapt and enjoy something better. Words from Ken Blanchard. So change is good. And yeah, we acknowledge that it's not easy. But having said that, I think we can all agree that change, although it is a constant, it can be embraced so that you can leverage success. And how do you do that? There are certain aspects of your organization that you can and probably are right now thinking that you need to change. One is the leadership, the individuals who are collectively tasked with navigating your organization forward. Yeah, you can and should be constantly thinking about adapting your strategy or maybe completely redoing it. Then there's the operational aspects, the policies, the procedures, the systems, all those organizational systemic aspects. And last, and certainly not least, in fact, what most individuals engage my services to help with is transforming their organizational culture. So people don't change a minute before they're ready. This is true. We understand this. The human animal is inherently risk averse and resistant to change. We gravitate towards stasis or the state of existing order. Having said that, what do we acknowledge? What are you probably contending with if you're looking to go down a path of meaningful change? Well, one is the individual mindset, where we're locked into our prevailing way of thinking and approaching problems. The other is an almost pathological desire to resist anything different. Again, that's part of our nature. And our habits. Our habits are what got us to this point in our lives. Good is good enough. And I would even posit that according to Jim Collins, who argued that good is actually the enemy of being great. So being good enough ensures that your organization will not evolve and will most likely be defeated. So with that as our conceptual framework to start out today, change does present an opportunity to shift our conversation, right, from one based on fear and resistance to change to a different mindset that's focused on hope and inherent opportunity, in which institutions like yours and your people, leaders and employees, all win. So if we acknowledge that change is actually an unshackling, it allows us, it permits us to think differently so that we can gain meaningful benefit. Is it time for a change? Well, I'd say over the last year, living in a global pandemic, the human being, everybody I've spoken to, the human dynamic is we are in a fundamental 21st century set of crises that are driving us to an unparalleled time of change. So why bother with this change? Well, ask yourself and have conversations within your organization. What's not working for us? Are you and your people prepared to change? We know that over the last year, people have been blindsided. And to this very day in 2021, people are still struggling to evolve and adapt to change in a world of COVID 2019. And so what are some of those evolutions that may occur? Delivering new services to a world that's socially distanced and people being detached from one another, including their loved ones. Finding access to new funding sources in a well that seems to have dried up. Identifying new revenue opportunities. Where is that new revenue coming from? Teachers and students trying to reconnect to conduct this thing called learning and education. And how is it going to happen, especially in communities that are socioeconomically challenged? So what are the drivers? What are the things, the wind in the proverbial sail of change, a sea change? Well, technological transformation is a constant. That's a constant underpinning that we have to adapt to. There's this sense of the world being connected in a way it never was due to technology and the internet and systems, networks that are interconnected. Now we have all of these different changes that are going socioeconomically, demographics, lifestyle, and that leads to a constant evolution in consumer tastes and preferences. And again, I alluded to it before. How do you change and thrive in a world in which we're losing those personal connections as we were forced away from interactions that were face to face and now interactions that are face to screen? So there are four principles at play. Understanding the world around you vis-a-vis change, planning for that change, and most likely you're in the process of between one and two. Then that big third step is implementing the change, while all the while, in many organizations I work with fail to realize, communication is the key to successfully navigate through change. So what's your plan look like? What is it going to take for you to implement massive transformation? Define the scope of what you're looking to accomplish and engage the people who are going to be involved in doing the change, influencing the change, paying for the change, championing it, all the requisite groups of individuals referred to as stakeholders. Then you go about building a team. And that's critically important, is identify who should be on board. You've got your roadmap, which you're going to evolve, which is your project plan comprised of tasks and the quantifiable determinants, the metrics that'll measure your successful transformation. Step 5, who's your sponsor? The sponsor is a funding source. The sponsor is an influential champion who is perceived as a charismatic individual or individuals. So who's your sponsor? Who do you need to obtain buy-in from? It may be inside your organization, it may be one or more stakeholders external, such as government entities or industry influencers or regulators. So who do you obtain buy-in from? And the seventh and most critical aspect of the planning process is, how will you ultimately be able to identify and measure success? So I want to introduce you to a concept called the change curve. The change curve, the Kubler-Ross change curve, acknowledged that if you think about going down, which is what's been happening. First, we've denied the need for fundamental core change, but you're experiencing this almost constant sense of frustration with the way internal factors inside your organization and external factors are influencing you. It leads to this miasma, this collective organizational individual depression. But the opportunity all of a sudden arises, and you're probably between depression and experimentation on the change curve. Experimentation is, let's start to identify things that we can try to change that'll influence or get us out of this ever declining state of existence. So experimentation, which maybe now is leading you to think about making a decision which integrates all of these different strategies around successfully navigating change. So you'll see that there's two arrows at play in Kubler-Ross. One is to reduce the organizational sense of depression, so you reduce the negative downward trend, and you shorten the time frame it takes you to go from identifying this state of depressive existence to implementing meaningful change. So you're shortening the curve. So those are those two factors that you're trying to influence and are probably thinking through right now, which leads me to sharing John Kotter's 8-step process for change. I just want to introduce the framework on this because it'll give you some insight as you look to start influencing change in your organization. So one is, how do you create a sense of meaningful urgency? And this is something that you can measure impact. So loss in market share, a loss in revenue, decline in client base, a lack of desire or passion or need or want or interest for your products and services. So one is create that sense of urgency, which will create a compelling story for you to wrap yourself around being a champion of change. And you're going to become a champion of change to build that coalition of people who are on board. Form a vision around what change looks like and the initiatives it's going to take to get you there. Then you can go about building your Dumbledore army, your volunteer army of individuals who are going to help you change. Next up, what are the barriers? I alluded to earlier the 3 barriers of humanistic thinking about embracing change, but you may have some very real obstacles, such as a built-in business model, an inflexible management team, an uncompromising market of regulatory environment, whatever those barriers are. Create little touch points of winning along the way. You want to build wind in your sails. You want to create a sense of momentum. And momentum is most often generated through identifying little short-term wins. According to Cotter, step 7 was to sustain that accelerated pace of change by little incremental wins till you start to see bigger picture transformation start to evolve. So you're identifying those little ink dots and you're starting to see a grand mosaic or picture on the landscape. And then 8 is meaningful change will start to evolve if you gain this acceleration over time of win after win after win. And then how do you formally institutionalize it so you can maintain over time? So I mentioned the Kubler-Ross change. As you do Cotter's 8 steps towards change, you'll see you go from denial all the way through the steps of the Kubler-Ross, all the way to integration. I want to point out that integration is not the end, actually. Integration is the end of the current state of change transformation. Then you may be faced with other future driving forces requiring change. So Cotter's the 8-step process, but Kubler-Ross is the framework where you're going to have to go through these steps sequentially, probably more than once. So the change cycle, I want to just introduce you to the 6 stages of a change cycle. And as you go through these 6 stages, you realize what you're doing along the way is experiencing certain things like loss and doubt. And then you start to get that feeling, as we talked about previously, of I've got to do something to institute organizational change or my organization won't survive. And that gets to tremendous discomfort as you're starting to feel anxiety, confusion, individual and collective lack of productivity. And then so now you get to discovery phase. We are starting to think about the steps required to implement change. You start to understand and gain confidence through a pragmatic approach or set of approaches to implement the change. And you start to see a shift in your workforce where they're going from being unproductive, working virtually, all of these considerations in prior stages of stage 1 and 2, to now a keener understanding of not only what success looks like, but where you're going to. And then stage 6 is the ultimate integration level where change and transformation is happening. And so I just want to create this visual, almost pinwheel of change and what it looks like through stages. And oh, by the way, identifying where you're now at in the process is critical. So distance learning. Distance learning is an academic endeavor, but it's also a workplace endeavor. And I want to introduce with you the need for a change in your organization's mindset about allowing and encouraging even your employees to work remotely. So the Buffer 2020 State of Remote Work identifies 3 key aspects of virtual work. So during the pandemic, 88% of employees were working remotely. That's pretty universal. Before it, less than a third. We also know that 70%, 7 out of 10 managers who were surveyed said that working from home is the same as or even better for their productivity. So we know having people work remotely isn't an adverse impact on productivity. The only thing I would mention is, unmentioned in the survey, is the health and mental state of people being detached from their connections. So while people are going to work remotely because there's a productivity argument justification for it, you still need to think in a new way about engaging people virtually, which is not easy. And that's a big piece of the work I'm doing with my consulting practice. So 98% of employees surveyed said after we get back to whatever the future of COVID looks like, they want to be able to work remotely, even a little bit of their time. That third bullet point is the keenest quantifiable metric I can present to you for the need to rethink and change your approach to working physically on premise versus virtually as a competitive strategy. So a lot of what is organizational challenge and need for change over the last year is thinking about planning for the unanticipated or the seemingly unexpected, and that's called contingency planning. Contingency planning is to have a set of scenarios that are different options or paths or roads that you can travel down. If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So you're identifying options for path forward, and you're describing what the circumstances is, and then you're looking at, from a business rational standpoint, from a positive perspective, if we do this, then this will happen. But from a potential negative adverse impact, well, if we do that, then this is likely to happen. And you're weighing both sides and you're almost scaling it. You're almost scaling each scenario or choice. And you're talking about what degree of risk you can tolerate from an organizational perspective. And you're thinking about things that overlay onto this, like staffing, budgetary concerns, access to new clients and markets. But those are contingency planning, scenario role playing. And so contingency planning is open for debate. I leave this slide blank because it's something that needs to be factored in on an individual basis in your organization. And typically, this is done at the top and communicated down. I would argue that as you're planning out your list of future contingency planning measures, it needs to be from the top, middle to bottom to frontline staff to have meaningful contingency plans in place. And that takes us, if you're talking about contingency planning and what are our options, you then have to look at the inherent risks that your organization is navigating as you're staying the course currently and as you're starting to implement a shift in approach to a new set of circumstances through change. What's the risk involved? And we know contingency planning is a piece of that. In order to start to deal with risk and to plan it and to budget it, you first have to get consensus or buy-in from the senior leadership team. But it's got to involve everyone. And this is the piece that my 25 years of work, my 12 years of consulting has always been somewhat lacking in organizations as they prepare for change. When they're thinking about risk and trying to embrace it as an opportunity, not everybody's brought on board. And that can prove detrimental. You want to constantly be looking at the risks and monitoring them and communicating them. And then all of the project work that you're doing needs to be looked at under the lens of risk and risk mitigation and taking advantage of risk, turning risk into reward or opportunity. In fact, you'd want to budget for it. You'd have meaningful line item budget into dealing with risk. So imagine if I were to sit down and do an audit of your 2021 budget and your strategic plan, we try to identify all the inherent touch points where there's inherent risk. You'd probably be amazed that it's in almost every aspect of your business, right? And then you budget and factor around that. And then the last piece is actually the most important piece. And it's something that I apply in all my organizational consulting and transformation work. Communicate, 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 communicate. No organization ever got into trouble for too much communication. That's a truism. So chaos is to be avoided, right? We want to maintain the course. We want to maintain stability. Actually, no. I understand that it's scary and exhausting to be on a roller coaster of nearly constant change and the chaos that comes from that. But let's think about what chaos means, especially with respect to how we identify the opportunities that exist in chaos. So chaos, what is it? There's great disorder. There's confusion. Sound familiar? It's a disorderly mass of jumble. It's complete confusion or any confused or disorderly collection or state of things, beings, entity. It's a conglomeration of parts or elements without any seeming connection. So here's the trick. You've identified it. We're starting to frame it for purposes of embracing it and making it a tool for us to leverage. So it means the strategies or your best laid plans are going to go awry. It's associated with things like missed deadlines, or you're understaffed, or all of a sudden you have skyrocketing costs and situations that just seem one after another negative aspect of your daily business existence that you have to contend with. This should sound like a pervasive state of existence, at least over the last year for all of us, right? Chaos describes a situation where the goals, your goals of a strategy are unachievable and therefore outcomes are seemingly random, unpredictable. Seemingly unpredictable. It's an undesirable state of existence and you want to avoid it at all costs. Well, actually, no. Chaos can be embraced if you adapt to the inherent disorder and not necessarily turn it into complete order and structure, but to understand how to be nimble enough to adapt to it. That's the key. You're not going to turn disorder into complete order and structure, but you're going to muscle memory change the way you and your organization respond to that chaos and adapt to it to leverage the opportunities underneath. And that comes from being able to plan for the almost unexpected. So how do you embrace the unexpected? So here's something that I always have to communicate. When I'm working with a client, we're working through their plan and their contingencies and risk management. They'll say, well, what's the purpose of planning anyway? Really? Well, you may not, through your planning, end up at the end of one year, let's say 2020, getting ready to look at what you're going to do in 2021. You may not end up doing all of what's in your plan. But actually, the benefit is to go through the planning process. It teaches you and your people how to go back and think about your business as you're looking forward to say, here's where we are, here's where we've come from, and here's where we're going. And then the piece that's missing is most organizations look at planning as a continuation of what worked. There's a piece of that, but it's also how do you plan for either what didn't work or what we can do differently. And then also you have to be able to act on that gut feeling. That fight or flight, when you feel like something is starting to trend out or change, you don't ignore that prickly feeling on the back of your neck. Don't overanalyze. In, for example, marketing in the 21st century with digital media and social media, you may have heard of the phrase ready, fire, aim, meaning don't overanalyze or do so much research that paralysis of analysis. You want to get presented with an opportunity, get together as an organization, imagine the contingencies, choose a course of action, take it, and then assess and learn on the fly. So you're changing your mindset of over-analysis beforehand to enough analysis to move forward, to change and transform and modify in process. So the benefit of the planning is you're thinking about getting ready to move forward to a different phase. You're looking again at what worked in the past, where you are now, and where you're going. But the where you're going, the benefit of the planning there is what can we do differently or what if? That's the question. What if this, then? And that's the benefit of planning, is to start to map out those potential changes, course corrects. And we want to avoid remaining locked into a plan, because doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome is the Albert Einstein classic definition of insanity. So having said that, you've got an organization that is rife, that is filled with priorities and demands. And some of those are vestiges or holdovers of your prior way of doing business. So how do you start to think about overcoming objections and dealing with change by taking a different course of action? You want to, if you're the champion of change or your senior leadership team or wherever those objections arise and you face resistance, you want to understand first, before you can make the change, how do you convince everybody to come on board with you? And what that means is creating little mini success strategies or little mini justifications for the rationale behind the need for change. I mentioned earlier in the Cotter framework, you want to celebrate the little wins, all the while constantly communicating and having a conversation with everybody involved in this change process. And you're constantly looking within. That's an inherent trap most individuals, most organizations fall prey to, is as they decide we need to change, they're not willing to think about how things are going along the way. And the last piece of what I want to share with you today is there's a tremendously powerful set of problem-solving tools that are at your and your people's discretion that when I typically coach on individually and as a team, a lot of organizations start to exponentially unleash their creativity in how they deal with and leverage change for benefit. So 2 questions you can ask as an individual and as an organization that are really powerful. Why are we doing it this way? Why? Why when this happens do we do that? Why? It's the most annoying but powerful question a toddler asks, and that's why from birth to the age of 5, individuals do most of the developmental brain growth and neuro growth, cognitive growth, because they're constantly asking why, to take in their external environment. At some point around the age of 5, our parents and society and teachers say, stop asking why, because I said so. I want you to rediscover the power of why. To start to think about making change. And then associated with why is what if. Why do we do it that way? What if? Don't run away from this. Embrace this mindset. This is what's going to get you down the road of change. It may sound simple, but in my consulting work, it is one of the biggest barriers to meaningful organization change is an unwillingness and an inability to look at why are we doing it this way and what if. Because it's scary. It means doing something new. It means starting over. It means leaving what we've known, the shoreline, to set out, charting a course in potentially turbulent waters. So one strategy is called the do it approach. And here's what this looks like. Define your problem. This is at the very beginning of today's webinar. I talked about identifying the problem, the defining it. And then the O is the opening up your and your team's mind to thinking about creative ways to approach the problem. So that's the do. And then the it is identify the solution or solutions if there are multiple options. And then the T in it is transform, is to implement, to chart a course for meaningful change. So do it is a way of framing on the front end to start to get to doing it on the back end. So there's two ways to get a team-based group idea generation process. So the most common is what's referred to as brainstorming, right? You get somebody inside your team, like a manager or an external person like me, a facilitator, to come in from the outside, get a group of 8 to 12 individuals on your team together, present the problem, come up with a creative set of solutions. This is the most common way of doing it, and it's flawed. It's flawed because what will invariably happen, we know from group dynamics, is a few relatively aggressive, socially extroverted individuals will take charge and run roughshod and try and dominate this group-based idea generation, problem-solving team. This should be something you now start to realize is not inclusive. And even in a state of virtual COVID, social distancing, it's harder to get people together in a proverbial room in the same place, same time. So now's an opportunity for me to introduce to you a different concept besides brainstorming, which is brainwriting. So instead of getting people together and having it be a verbal, charismatic personality controlling, you get a bunch of individuals to identify a problem. And then each individual is the index card solution. So the index card means you give the team each individual set of index cards or a way to write down what the primary problem is and what are some potential solutions. And then you gather up everybody's ideas once they've been provided, and then you distribute every individual on the team's ideas to somebody else, and they look through and they say, okay, that idea has merit because, okay, what would we do if? So you provide a critical lens to each solution, and then you say, well, if we did that then, so then a second individual has a chance to go over and comment on the first, and then you collect those, and then you distribute them a third time to another individual for each of those original set of ideas. And so the third person looks at the first person's ideas to solve the problem, and the second individual's comments, and the third person adds their commentary. And then you collect them back, and then you organize them into different buckets or types of solution, and then you can either have the group as a whole virtually provide insight, or you can break out based on problem solution sets into sub-teams and work. And that's called brainwriting. It does a better job of bringing the roughly 30 to 40% of introverts into a more meaningful contribution, because we know that introverts by behavioral and style at work type tend to be more analytical and thus think more expansively, and they take often a more contrarian view of solutions by asking why and what if. So brainwriting is a strategic alternative to idea generation than what brainstorming used to give us. Brainstorming is a little bit more limited. So I want to introduce the Walt Disney creative strategy. So what Walt Disney did going back to the 1950s when he got a bunch of animators together was he said, we've got these very real technical and transformation problems. He wanted to create a full-length motion picture, which ultimately became in 1958 Steamboat Willie. So what he did was he got his animators together and he said, we're going to have, first of all, a focus on the dreamer in us. So he broke people out into subgroups and he said, come up with the most wild solution. solutions that you could possibly think of. There's no limitation. So that was the first step, the dreamer phase. And then the group, his animators, reconvened, and they took a realistic approach to each potential dream big kind of solution. And the realistic was, well, if we did that, we need to factor into this. And if we did that, we would need that. So step two, the realist started to give some structure and clarity to that very big picture dreamer set of solutions. And then he would get his animators to go back and take those proposed solutions and be very critical and try and tear them apart by infusing each of those dreamer kind of concepts with a very critical lens. And then you'd go through all three phases, and that ultimately led to coming up with this set of technical solutions that enabled Walt Disney to release Steamboat Willie, and the rest, as they say, is history. So this is the Walt Disney animator creative process, dreamer, realist, critic. And I mentioned that dreamer phase. Right, that dreamer phase has just as much relevance today. And when I do a bunch of group-based team problem solving, I start here. Blue sky speculation is those big ideas. There's no arbitrary dictated limitations. It's the boldest, wildest ideas that you can conceivably come up with. They're big, go home kind of mindset. And then another strategy is what we call starbursting. And anybody who has a journalism background or is a reporter understands the starburst. So the 5 W's and H. So you start around a central idea or an issue or challenge that's demanding you think about change. Who's involved? Who are the stakeholders? Who's the actors in this play? What are you looking to accomplish? What's at risk? How are you going to do it? This comes up with idea generation. How are we going to achieve this solution? How are we going to overcome this issue? When? What's the time frames? If it's a project, what are the benchmarks? What's the deliver by date, the launch date? What are key milestones, like a regulatory situation? Why? Why are we heading down this road in the first place? Why is actually, if you think about it, almost the business rationale or justification. Next up, down this problem-solving journey to not only deal with change, but to embrace it, is metaphorical thinking. So metaphorical thinking is you take two seemingly disconnected ideas like time is money, and you marry them together. Time is money never mattered. It had no existence until we took people off their farms and went from an agrarian to manufacturing society where the farmers came into the big cities, got a job on the assembly line, and they were able to know on every day they would make, let's say, $5. So they'd know if they worked 12 hours, they could figure out every hour I had guaranteed money coming in. Well, that sounds a little bit more predictable and therefore attractive than being on the farm and spending months and months breaking my back to harvest a crop that I took to market that may or may not make me any money because, well, it's contingent on the weather and marketplace taste preference. So yeah, time is money had no meaning until they became connected. That's metaphorical thinking, is attaching two seemingly different ideas. Attribute listing, think about your business as a set of functional areas: marketing, sales, R&D, procurement. And you start to think about each of the tasks that are performed in each of your functional areas, and you start to then overlap and tie them together. 4P perspective. I want to walk you through this. So problem perspective, what's the problem that we're talking about? Most times people don't identify what the problem is correctly or all the impacts. So the first thing you're going to do is you start to go down creative problem solving is to identify the problem. So taking that perspective. The second P is planning. How are you going to plan this out? What are the resources that are needed? And that takes us to the people perspective. And the simple way that I can explain this when I coach on building optimal performing teams is, do you have the right people in the right roles right now at the right moment? And then the potential perspective is the business impact, thinking long term as we tackle this problem and we're leading through change by addressing this problem. What's the potential perspective? That might be revenue potential. It might be access to new markets. It may be partnering. It may be identifying a new vendor. So the potential is what's at risk, what's at stake, what's to be gained. And all of this means that problems can't be solved thinking within the framework of what you're used to. The last concept I'm going to introduce you to, and I know I've given you a lot to think about today, and I'll give you my contact details so we can talk one-on-one about working through different aspects of thinking about and going down the road of meaningful change and transformation, is the Socratic method, and this is infused and has been in the American legal system and teaching the Socratic method in law school, is you take a problem, you take a topic, you take a change issue that your organization is dealing with, and then you split up your team who's tasked with leading your organization through change, and you tackle that problem by taking two oppositional viewpoints. So one team takes the pro position, one team takes the con. So you start out with the pro team. They do the research, they present all of the business rationales, the driving factors why you should choose this course of action. Now the other side is what Disney had on that third stage, the critic stage. Their opposition is predicated on finding flaws in the rationale, the business rationale, which was the pro side. And then what you do in pure genius of the Socratic method is you flip roles. So the critic becomes the advocate and the advocate becomes the critic. And what this does is it'll teach your change transformation team how to consider a lot of the factors at play and to look at that set of solutions from the broadest possible perspective. So there are a few resources that I alluded to before: Levitt Diamond, the Berkeley and Change Model, Impact Analysis, SIPIC diagrams. There are resources that can help prepare you technically, or your team that's undertaking this transformation and change project. And there are collaboration tools as we talk about getting people in your organization to work more effectively as a team to tackle these change transformation projects remotely. A final thought: when life gives you lemons, as they've been doing, and I don't minimize or trivialize the state of existence we've all been dealing with, but there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity that's fundamental in any scary time where massive change is afoot. And we're in such times. And the only way forward is to not run from the need for change, but to embrace it in a meaningful fashion. That's the greatest benefit to all those people in your organization. So having said that, your work is going to fill a large part of your life. And the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. Eudaimonia is the fullest and purest expression of you in your most elevated state. Imagine that as you're going through undertaking this massively important set of change and transformation that you're thinking about. I want to thank you for taking the time to spend with us today on this webinar on how do you embrace change for lasting competitive advantage. And as my thank you, I want to give you my contact details. Be sure to email me or reach out to me on my cell phone. Take a look at some of the other videos on my YouTube channel to see what else strikes your fancy. And as my thank you for being here today, I'd like to offer you a complimentary consulting session where we can talk through some of these or any other issues. And be sure to check me out on my website at thechazingroup.com. Thank you for your time and wishing you the best of luck as you go down the road of meaningful transformation. Thank you.